So Andrew Martin, Professor of Educational Psychology, UNSW, and my areas of research are student motivation, student engagement, student achievement and student wellbeing.
And when I ask some questions, I'm going to be cutting my questions out, so if you could sort of reiterate the question in your answer, so what is grit? Grit is this, and even if you don't necessarily agree with my question or statement, sort of reiterate it and then refute it or whatever.
Yeah, okay.
Okay, alright, so starting off with that fairly simple one, what is grit?
So grit is a construct or a factor that falls under the umbrella of response to adversity. Other constructs or factors that fall under that umbrella include resilience, buoyancy, coping, mental toughness, and so each of these in different ways are responses to adversity. There's significant overlap amongst them, but for the most part they're attributes that we would invoke to respond to a difficulty, a setback or an adversity.
Has Angela Duckworth's research on grit made it to Australia?
So research in this area that's made it to Australia, probably the big one is resilience, and so that's been around for a couple of decades now. But more recently, grit has received attention and interest in Australia, and so increasingly schools and other areas of performance like sport and the arts, the word, whereas resilience was quite a common word, the word grit is starting to creep in, and indeed some schools are taking it on as the specific factor or construct that they're interested in their students developing.
Great. Just focus. And what does teaching grit, response to adversity, social emotional learning look like in Australia?
So, as far as the approach is used in Australia, there's a lot of different ones. Some schools and some practitioners will try and teach a response to adversity quite directly. So they will look directly at a setback or a difficulty that a young person has to wrestle with, and they'll talk quite directly about how to deal with that adversity, or how to what they should do, what they should think in response to that difficult situation or setback. Other approaches to developing grit or resilience are where they try and look at attributes of the person that might help them out in a difficult situation. So, for example, they'll look at the person's self-confidence, they'll look at the person's persistence, they'll look at the person's sense of control, that is how much that young person thinks they're in the driver's seat or not. And so that's an approach where we look at the factors underlying resilience and grit. And then other approaches again to promoting grit and resilience and buoyancy where the environment is improved. And so those schools, for example, will be creating climates and environments where teachers are very nurturing and supportive of children's social and emotional development. And so that's more of a contextual approach. And of course, you can take all three. Probably the most comprehensive approach to promoting, grit, resilience, what have you, is where you help students directly with the situation of adversity. You help them develop the attributes that they can bring to that situation, and you create an environment that helps them.
Is identifying a student's long-term goals, identifying what they've been resilient or gritty about in related fields, is it possible or practicable to actually have that kind of individualized intervention so that the student can take ownership or responsibility for their self-directed learning or education?
So there's a bit of a debate at the moment as to whether you can take whole school approaches to this sort of thing, or whether it's such an individualised thing you really need to be assisting individuals. What we tend to find is that a more individualised approach to almost anything in education is generally more effective than whole school approaches. So there can be a whole school interest in grit and resilience and so on, but when it comes to nurturing that construct, a little more of an individualised approach is necessary. So for example, one approach to enhancing grit and resilience and coping and buoyancy is, for example, through goal setting, where you set a goal, you have something to work towards, and when that goal is set and you map out the steps involved in getting there, you're in a much better place to deal with setbacks as it arises, because you can return to the game plan as to what you're planning to do, and you can keep an eye on the goal, and that enhances perseverance as well. And so different children will have different goals, and different children will have different plans and steps in working towards that goal. So even though there'll be a whole school or a whole class interest and focus on resilience and grit, we find that a more effective approach is to individualise that where you can.
So the social emotional learning handbook that you're going to have published next year, does that look at implementing response to adversity or grit in a sort of in a co-curriculum, in a curriculum sort of way, in putting it into a syllabus, or somehow having additional classes on social emotional learning?
Yes, so we're about to publish a handbook on social emotional learning, and response to adversity falls under the umbrella of social emotional learning. So you have social emotional learning as an overarching area. Within that are things like a sense of responsibility. Within that is help giving and participation. But another aspect under social emotional learning is response to adversity and resilience. And so what we've found in this handbook, which will be published next year by Springer, what we've found in this handbook is that the debate right now or one of the debates is, do you build this in as part of the curriculum? That is, in which case, and if you do you make it a specific subject? So some advocates are saying, alongside English and maths and PDH, PE and so on, there should be actually a subject or a topic dedicated to developing social emotional learning, and if that school's focus is grit and resilience, that's what you do. Other approaches are where other advocates say, look, it should be cross-curricular. So every subject offers the opportunity to develop resilience and grit. Every subject, for example, will offer adversity and setback and challenge. And so they're all an opportunity to build these social emotional skills into the everyday course of teaching and learning. What's the most effective approach? I think it'd come down to the school and what the school is best able to do. And so some schools will have a very good communication across the curriculum areas and teachers, and maybe so that might work in that case. But if there's not so much good communication across faculties and departments, maybe you do need to carve out some time to develop these skills a little more singularly. So it'll come down to the school, I think.
Perhaps this isn't quite so empirical as your expertise would be based in, but the anecdotal experience that most people identify as having their one meaningful teacher, their best teacher, oftentimes isn't even necessarily interested in just the one subject that they're teaching, but they're more able to identify what a student's interest is, even if it's tangential to what they're teaching them, and then encourage that, foster that sort of long-term goal setting and course correcting to that, even if it is extracurricular activities or something like that. Is there a way to transfer students' grit for long-term goals in extracurricular activities to academia?
So the question around can you transfer grit or mental toughness or resilience from one area in which you might be resilient to another area in which that you might be struggling, for example? The answer to that's not so straightforward, and in fact, the answer to that isn't as positive as we'd like it to be. What you're talking about here is transfer, and that is, can we transfer an attribute or something, a skill learned in one area to another? Transfer is difficult to get in us human beings. We tend to, the skills we develop in one area tend to be very specific and particular to that area, and applying them to another area is difficult. And we often find that a lot of interventions where we conduct an intervention where we build skills in one area and then hope it kicks onto other areas, we often find it doesn't. And so what's needed, that's not to say it's not possible, but it needs certain conditions to transfer. And those conditions usually around where children, young people are explicitly taught how to transfer the skill, how to use the skill in one area and apply it to another area, and be given very good scaffolding from one area to the other, and give very good examples on how, and practice on how they would develop their skills and attributes developed in grit and resilience and coping, how they would use that in another specific area. Simply building it up in one area and hoping it transfers, that's very difficult and relatively unusual in us human beings that tend to live fairly silo-like lives. And so, but where we're able to explicitly teach how to embed a particular skill in another area, that's where we meet with more success.
So looking at somebody who, say, was a child soldier and managed to overcome that adversity, is it a very individual, internal psychological struggle where they then say, oh, I managed to overcome that situation, so what is becoming a lawyer compared to that? Is that at all possible to study that sort of individual's motivation?
So having said that transfer is very difficult, another part of this equation is that we have certain personality traits and dispositions that will carry from one situation to another. And so there are some temperaments, there are some personalities that are likely to deal with adversity better across different areas of challenge. And so what we find on average, and this is being very crude and blunt in the estimation, we find about 50% of our capacity to deal with certain situations rests in personality and temperament and disposition. But that leaves another 50% that can be taught and learnt. Now, for some people it'll be 60-70% personality that reigns supreme. For others it's a little less of an influence on individual situations, but on average. And so in cases where someone moves from one very difficult situation to another, without really having been taught how to, that's probably where there's more of an underlying resilience and grit. But having said that, that won't account for all of their capacity to respond to adversity. So even though they go into a new situation reasonably resilient, there will still be a number of skills and attributes specific to that new area that they would do well to learn. But that's probably a part of their personality. They're adaptable and capable of learning these things reasonably quickly. And so you get this virtuous loop, if you like. Having said that, we're not stuck with our personalities or our disposition. So if about 50% is set, 50% that we can make a big difference on, I see that as great cause for optimism and great scope for assisting all children and young people.
That sounds like the classic studies of learned helplessness versus learned industriousness.
Yeah, indeed, and we're getting to this classic tension between trait, those things that are a little more set in our being, and state, those things that we can learn and change. Having said that, I do believe there's a theory referred to as free trait theory, and that is that even if we have a certain personality or resilience style, we can override that if we have to. And indeed, we often have to override aspects of our personality. We can't walk into the workplace and let our full personality unleash. We'd be out of a job in a couple of days, I suspect. And so we're always regulating aspects of our personality and our traits. And so I do believe in our great capacity to adapt and adjust and to be resilient in the face of adversity when needed.
So transfer is the holy grail of educational psychology?
Transfer is the holy grail of educational psychology. It's possible, but with good support and good instruction on how to get that transfer from one domain to another.
The second last point that I have to put to you is I'm wondering, looking at case studies of people who have been able to get long-term goals and do have a lot of second chances to overcome adversity, it seems to be predominantly a luxury of the affluent. Is grit only for the affluent? Do poor students not get as many second chances at long-term goals in education?
The resilience research started in streets of poverty, in urban areas of crime, in rural areas of unemployment. Resilience research began with why do some kids make it and other kids don't, even though they're in the same circumstances, and that's what sparked off the great interest in what are these attributes and skills that even though two kids from the same environment, one kid can make it and another kid can't. And so that research was very promising because there are many kids that were able to flourish in spite of their circumstances. Having said that, because we know context is a very critical part of helping a kid work through adversity, we know that access to resources is also important to help kids who have particular difficulties or disability and so on. Then that it follows that those with greater socioeconomic advantage have better contextual and environmental opportunities to work through their adversities, and they often have the supports, the human supports around them that can do that as well. And so it is the case that socioeconomic advantage and socioeconomic disadvantage is relevant to this resilience debate. And to the extent that that's the case, then you know that there's a great responsibility to focus, to ensure there's a focus on those that are socioeconomically disadvantaged, because certainly as far as environment goes, they have less opportunity to bounce back.
Just finally, I'm interested in UNSW as a sort of microcosm of what's possible in education in Australia, looking at David Gonski being the Chancellor, the Aspire program for educational disadvantages here, there's an educational psychology department, and now the Australia Research Council has funded research at UNSW almost as much as all the other Sydney-based universities combined. Do you think that UNSW is onto something in terms of education that should give hope for sort of macro, bigger picture implementation?
I think every university finds its way to give opportunities to different students and different stakeholders, and so I won't speak for other universities, but certainly UNSW does does a lot of stuff that to support students from different backgrounds. A lot of stuff with regards to innovation and innovative research. It now has a very long 2025 strategy, and so there's the goal setting part of resilience and so on. And certainly certainly the Chancellor had the authority over the Gonski report, as it's referred to. And the Gonski report is very much about individualised and personalised learning. It's a funding report, but it spoke very closely to how for needs-based funding. And so I guess all of that collectively under underscores the sorts of approaches to helping students flourish and work to their personal best.